Hello again, everyone. Edwin Learnard back once again. In this YouTube astrological segment, I'm going to be dissertating and talking about astrology and depression. And when I talk about astrology and depression, I'm not just talking about the clinical depression. What I'm talking about as well is really about despondency, about sadness, about quote unquote melancholia, being in a melancholy state, maybe a little bit more stronger than the average person. I think some indicators to look at as far as depression and natal chart and just feelings of sadness. I think one obvious thing would be if one has a preponderance of planets, influences in earth signs, even somebody that has one of what I refer to one of the three main proponents in one's natal chart, the sun, moon, or ascendant in an earth sign, or at least one, there can be a little bit more of a sadness than generally speaking. The disposition of earth signs are generally serious, and they do they seem to exude more of that stern but yet sad energy as well. And I think that's something to look at. And another thing to look at, I think the real strong indicator of this is the planet Saturn. If somebody has Saturn afflicted, whether it's by sign, house placement, receives predominantly negative or adverse aspects, this can play a role, I believe. And I think something you can look at as well are even conjunctions from Saturn to prominent spots in one's natal chart, such as the ascendant. Saturn conjunct the moon, Saturn conjunct Mercury, even because Mercury has to do with our thinking. Saturn also conjunct the sun can give not just that stern, serious disposition, but it can incline toward, I would think, a little bit more of a melancholy side to the person. I have Saturn conjunct my ascendant from the 12th house, and it's in an earth sign, Taurus. And also Saturn, which leads me to talk about Saturn in the 12th house. For some reason, I believe this could be an element of one where one could be express some kind of feelings of being disconsolate or sad or dejected. The 12th house is the house of mental illness, and it doesn't mean that somebody that has one or even a plethora of planets in the 12th house is going to have some chronic depression or have some mental illness or instability. But when I look at this, it is still technically that's what the 12th house is. And I think if somebody were to have, say, Saturn in the 12th, which is is that house of illness connected with mental illness in all, or they could have Saturn in the 6th house. The 6th house is just general sickness. Now, could there be a stronger propensity for perhaps even having the chronic depression, or at very least have some strong feelings of despondency that are a little bit more intensified than the average person? Then I think the possibility greatly increases with that. But I think for somebody to actually have a strong or some really severe case of depression connected with their natal chart, they have to have multiple factors or elements. I don't think it's going to be just one. So if somebody has Saturn in the 12th house and Saturn has good aspects and everything else seems good with Saturn by sign, then that's just only one thing. Will the person, maybe if it's conjunct the ascendant, would the person exhibit maybe a little bit more sadness in their outer demeanor? Quite possibly. I think also if somebody has transits, they can look at if Saturn transits the 1st house or Saturn enters the first house by progression. This could be an indicator where the person might come across as a little bit not just stern or serious, but also maybe a little bit more sadder than usual, maybe a little bit more melancholy. I think also, let's say for example that somebody were to have in their progressed ascendant went from Sagittarius to Capricorn, well, or goes into an earth sign. Well, this could be another possibility where one might exhibit maybe a little sadder state, at least superficially, to others. If their progressed sun enters Capricorn or another earth sign, this could be something as well. The moon entering an earth sign, this could indicate this. My progressed moon right now is in Capricorn in the 7th house of relationships, so this could indicate some kind of sadness or despair in matters connected with this. I think also another thing to maybe look at with Saturn, also if your progressed Saturn has entered your 6th or 12th house, though, that could be another indicator, I would say, of maybe expressing maybe a little bit more despondency. And the 6th house is the house of health, and the one maybe in some remote instances somebody that has Saturn traversing their 6th house through progression or transit, perhaps they might feel maybe a little stronger depression in them than ordinarily it could. And I'm just saying, I'm not saying that this is very frequent or anything, but I see this as a stronger possibility as opposed to being in another house. So I think it's the 1st, the 6th, and 12th houses to look at. Also, Saturn hitting the 3rd house. The 3rd house it has to do with communication, assimilation of information, our thinking. This could indicate in more cases than not, Saturn in the 3rd natally, by transit, by progression. This could indicate a more seriousness connected with one's thinking. A lot of times, and on the positive side, more structure and discipline with this. But it could also indicate pessimistic thought, which can lead to sadness and lead to at least a depressed-like state, I believe. So those are some things to look at. Some other things to consider, too. Now, I wouldn't rule out the moon. I think Saturn figures more prominently in what I'm talking about. But the moon has to do with our emotions. So that's something to look at if the moon is afflicted. The moon makes predominantly negative aspects. It's something to look at moon, perhaps in the houses that I wouldn't say necessarily the houses I talked about, because I don't think the moon in the 12th or the 1st or 3rd or 6th could indicate this. But the moon is our emotions. So I believe, like if somebody has the moon in an earth sign, say even a moon in Capricorn afflicted, this could give a little more propensity, I think, towards some general sadness, at least with the person. I knew someone figured prominently in my life many years ago. She had the moon in Capricorn in the 6th house of health, and it opposed her Saturn in the 12th. And the Saturn was in its detriment in Cancer in the 12th house, and Saturn also conjoined her ascendant. So those are some things to consider. If I'm not mistaken, I believe her moon also opposed her ascendant, and it also opposed Mars in Cancer, and Mars in Cancer, as many of you know, it's in its fall. So those are some things to look at as far as astrology, and being as far as just some general sadness, being a little bit more disconsolate perhaps than usual, a little bit more dejected. I would look at those elements as far as astrology and perhaps connection with depression. Also, if your 3rd house ruler conjoins your natal Saturn, that's something to look at, because Saturn is our way of thinking, The third house is connected with our communication and our thinking, assimilation of information. And if the ruler of the third can join Saturn, I think that's something to look at. If the ruler of the third makes a negative or adverse aspect to Saturn, that's also something to consider. Ruler of the sixth house, the house of health, makes a negative aspect to Saturn or conjoins Saturn. The ruler of the 12th house as well, if that makes a negative aspect to Saturn or conjunct Saturn, I think that's something that one can consider as far as perhaps maybe at least just maybe a little above average state of sadness. And I really think those are a number of elements to look at. And remember that you could also have modifying influences in your chart. If you have these things that I discussed, but say you have say you have Jupiter conjunct your ascendant, for example, Sagittarius ascendant, the Sun, Moon in Sagittarius, a Sagittarius chart signature, Jupiter well aspected in your chart. Those things can modify, I think, the sadness connected with Saturn and the other elements I described as far as the melancholia or the strong, maybe above average feeling of feeling depressed. I think those are some things to definitely consider. Well, anyway, people, that'll conclude this YouTube astrological segment for astrology and depression. Two things I want to get with you on before I head out. Firstly, the stars may impel but do not compel. And secondly, never isolate any single astrological element, aspect, planetary placement, position, configuration, influence, or what have you, and make an analysis of a person, astrologically speaking, based on this alone, because astrologically speaking, the person is the sum of all their components in their natal chart, and not just one. Until next time, people, stay well.